Okay, thank you very much, Andrew Mercado, for your time today. First of all, you start your documentary with the quote, "Which country was the first in the world to broadcast LGBT characters?"
Well, I think this is the point of the documentary. I think one of the things I discovered in 2019, which was the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, was that there were a lot of pop culture and queer reporters talking about the greatest LGBT moments in the 50 years since Stonewall. And I could see there that Australian TV wasn't getting the recognition it deserved. So I thought, right, it's time to set the record straight and tell the rest of the world that it was Australia who was the first to broadcast lesbian, gay, bisexual and transsexual characters on primetime TV.
In TV drama?
Correct.
Okay. What was Number 96 and how did Number 96 begin and why was it so daringly ahead of its time?
Number 96 was created because at the time the third rating network in Australia was the O10 network. They were on the verge of bankruptcy. They did not have a hit show. So they decided to gamble really big. And you know, sometimes when you gamble big, you get a huge payoff. And that's what's happened with Number 96. They asked for a racier version of Coronation Street. Coronation Street was a big hit in Australia at the time. They could see the potential of a soap opera working. But in 1972, Australians were kind of eager to change. We were kind of emerging from decades of conservative rule and really draconian censorship. And free-to-air TV in Australia took advantage of the mood in Australia. And when they said, we want a racier version of Coronation Street, they got one and the audience was waiting and ready for it.
It had a lot of heterosexual nudity and heterosexual sex and,
yep.
and homosexual depictions. Can you...
Well, Number 96 was extremely daring for the time. Yes, there was nudity. Yes, there were taboo subjects being talked about in this drama for the first time on TV, sometimes in the world. And it was a very racy show and it took full advantage of its adults-only time slot at 8:30 p.m. every weeknight. And I think this is one of the main reasons why it didn't go around the world in the way that, say, Neighbours did or A Country Practice. You know, you could edit out maybe some of the nudity in Number 96, but you could not edit out some of the themes and some of the storylines. There was an interracial love affair between an African-American man and a white woman. Early on in the show, like episode 30, they kissed. That ruled the show out for American TV. Yes, there were lots of homosexual themes throughout the show. So there were just so many elements to the show. It made it virtually impossible for anyone else in the world to screen it, except for Australia.
We're looking at what other countries did in terms of representations of LGBT characters on TV drama in the 70s. And
Yep.
were these positive role models?
Well, look, they were trying their very best to do it. You know, you did have shows that were still hitting a lot of the tropes and a lot of the stereotypical cliches about gay men. Gay men through the 1960s, if you saw them on TV, certainly on Australian TV, they would be victims of poofter bashing. They would be getting blackmailed for being gay. They were often victims. They were often wimps. They were often distinguished by wearing handbags and dressing in a very camp way. And if we look at 1972 around the rest of the world, that was the year that Are You Being Served began on British TV. And, you know, throughout the entire run of that show and afterwards, the show's creators and John Inman always steadfastly refused to admit that Mr. Humphreys was gay. Oh, he's just a man who loves his mother.
What was his catchphrase?
I'm free. I'm free. He minced around the place like the gayest man on TV, but they would never, ever admit that he was a homosexual. So that was the feeling on British TV at the time. And then if you look at American TV was dipping its toe into positive queer depictions on TV, but they were always one-offs. You know, there was a movie called That Certain Summer, a telemovie with Hal Holbrook and Martin Sheen, but there was a huge to-do around it. All of these advertisers fled. No one would advertise around it. That was 1972. And in 1971, All in the Family had an episode with a gay footballer in it, which really, really upset President Nixon. When we listen back to the Watergate tapes, we can hear him being totally disgusted that All in the Family had showed that a gay man could be a big, tough footballer and nobody could pick he was gay. He was horrified by that and really angry about it. But you've got to look at that. That happened once. Was that groundbreaking for American TV? Yes, it was. But you know, Archie Bunker meets the man in the pub, one of his old drinking mates, discovers he's gay, kind of goes okay, and then we never see that gay man again. And that's, I think, one of the issues about American TV. They're dipping their toe in, but no one is doing it on a long-running or a regular basis.
So tell me, Andrew, how did number 96 generally portray LGBT characters?
It was quite revolutionary what they did, and I think what's really telling about number 96's depiction of queer people is that there's no internalised homophobia coming from the writers. The creator of number 96 was a man called David Sale. He was asked to create the show. He was taken to the block of apartments and said, "That's where we want to set it. What do you think?" And he said, "Well, I think you'd have to have a whole bunch of diverse characters in there because that's a lot of stories you'd have to keep that show running." And he just asked straight up. He was a gay man living in Sydney. He knew that there was a big underground gay scene in inner city Sydney at the time, and that this apartment block was set in inner city Sydney. So he asked the producers, "Could I have a homosexual couple in the show?" And he reports that without even blinking, the American producer Bill Harmon said, "Sure, but give me homosexuality without any deviation." And David Sale took that to be a yes. And what Bill Harmon was actually saying to him is, yes, but don't give me a deviant. Let's avoid the cliches of the past. And so David Sale just wrote in a regular gay couple into the show. And I don't think he or the producer or the actors who would play that role had any idea that what they were going to do was going to be so accepted by the audience. But yes, when number 96 began, there was a gay couple living in the building, although it took a few weeks for them to reveal the true nature of that relationship, as all good soapies should do.
The main gay character was played by Joe Hesham. He was Don.
Yep.
And tell me a little about him.
Joe Hesham was the most incredible casting for what was such an important role. Joe Hesham wasn't gay in real life, but he literally asked at the audition, when he was asked, "How do you feel about playing a gay man on national TV?" He sort of hesitated and they said, "Do you have a problem with that?" And he said, "Well, yeah, I have a lot of gay friends and I want to make sure that we're not going to do anything that's going to reflect badly on him." And of course, as soon as he said that, the producers went, "Wow, we've got the right actor here." And David Sale recently revealed to me that not only did, at the first script reading for number 96, Joe Hesham came up to him very quietly and said, "In this relationship, which character is the dominant one?" So he was even basically asking back then and was aware of the terminology of who's the top and who's the bottom in this relationship to help them with crafting those characters. So that's an incredibly socially aware person there. I know that Joe Hesham was very interested in all of the social stuff around Aboriginal land rights and women's lib. He was part of all of that. And of course, running hand in hand in that was gay liberation. And I guess that because he was an actor and had been a trained actor for many years, he knew a lot of other gay actors. So he was very up on all of that. And he wanted to make sure that he was doing the right thing. And of course, he went above and beyond what any of us would have expected with a beautiful character like that on TV.
And he played a lawyer.
He did. And I think this is really important too, because this is how he accidentally became the hero of the show. Don Finlayson was a law student when it began. As the show progressed, he became working as a barrister, and then he opened his own lawyer's office in partnership with somebody else. So, of course, what happens then? You've got 8 flats in number 96, and the moment any character has a problem, they immediately run to the lawyer. Don, can you help me out? And so that sort of made him the de facto hero in the show. And it's interesting because number 96 ran for over 1,200 episodes, and Don, as played by Joe Hesham, was one of only 3 characters to be there from the beginning to the very end.
Tell me about the coming out story of Don Finlayson, played by Joe Hesham in the series, which first aired in 1972, and how that particular plot developed.
Well, they kept the relationship between Don and his bisexual boyfriend Bruce, as played by Paul Wynecott. They kept that kind of under wraps. There were clues, but they were very, very subtle. A couple of the critics at the time said things like, I'm very suspicious about the couple where the men walk around in their underwear. So, they were sort of throwing red herrings out to the audience, but not spelling it out. And certainly in 1972, with barely any mention of homosexuality on TV, it wouldn't have been what most people were thinking. In the story, their next door neighbour, Bev, who was played by the very beautiful Abigail, you can see that she's falling in love with Don, and in this episode she comes on very hot and heavy and basically begs him to sleep with her. And of course you see him getting all uncomfortable, and that's when he announces to her, I thought you knew about me and Bruce. And she goes, knew what? And he says, I'm a homosexual. And that was used as a kind of a shocking moment in the show and a cliffhanger, and she reacts very, very badly to that news and spends a couple of episodes throwing all sorts of slurs at him. But it's the episode where she comes to her senses and comes to his front door and knocks on the door and says, please, I want to apologise for the way I've behaved. Everyone's got their own way of life. I realise that now. I thought I was the sophisticated one. I mean, that is an incredible moment to the audience because, as some of the people in my documentary have pointed out, you're basically sending this message to the audience. If you would like to be less old-fashioned and more sophisticated, be more accepting of the fact that not everybody wants to lead a very straight and narrow lifestyle the way that you're expected to live in 1972 in Australia.
How did the role affect Joe Hasham's personal life and career?
It didn't seem to negatively affect him at all. In fact, he very quickly became the number 1 male pin-up of the show. He was hugely popular. He got a ton of fan mail. There were posters of him in TV Week. As the show went on, his popularity just kept growing and growing. He released his own record. He released an LP. He got his own primetime variety special on Channel 10. He got married early on, like in the first year of the show. He got married to one of the publicists at Channel 10, and that was promoted all through the TV magazines. It's interesting, though, to look back on it, though, because when you look back at the press of the day, you can see that he's hugely popular and everyone wants to capitalise on that. But you could see that the press was a little bit wary of the type of character he was playing. A lot of time they just conveniently left out the fact that he was playing a homosexual. I think it becomes really apparent when he ends up in a live-in relationship with a boyfriend called Dudley, as played by Chad Haywood. They are living together in the show for 3 years, and yet no magazine ever really acknowledges it. Or they kind of say, Don and Dudley are flatmates. No, they're more than flatmates. They're actually live-in lovers. But the press really was trying to downplay that because they were uncomfortable with this notion that homosexuality was being presented by that and that the audience was responding to it. And the audience did accept his character and they did like his character. And along with all of the mail he was getting from females, young girls, mothers saying, I've got a daughter that can turn you straight. There was a lot of fan mail coming in from gay men, and the gay men was saying to him, thank you. Thank you for showing that there is a future where I could go to the big city and be accepted. And Joe Hashem, to his absolute credit, personally wrote back to every one of those gay men. And he made it known amongst the production staff what was happening there. And so they then became quite protective of the character. And when Channel 10 actually decided for the first time after a year of record-breaking ratings and revenue, when they finally said, oh, we'd like to change something, what they wanted to change was they wanted to turn the character of Don straight. And that's when Bill Harmon, the producer of the show, stepped in and said, that's not going to happen. And if you ever ask for that again, I'll take the show off you and take it to another network. So I think that when you talk about the definition of a queer ally, you put Joe Hashem and producer Bill Harmon into that character because they saw the positive impact that that show was having, and they very quickly became queer allies.
Number 96 also had the world's first transgender character in TV drama.
Yeah.
One of the show's more naive characters tried to date her, I believe.
Yes. There was a character in the show, I would describe him as a nerd, Arnold Feather. He arrived in the show, he was keen to lose his virginity. He had a lot of romantic disasters that never ever quite happened. He was a character there for a bit of comic relief. I would say that Don was a character there to provide drama because of his law background. But other characters like Arnold Feather were there to provide comic relief. And so along this path of always picking the wrong girl, Arnold Feather, as played by Jeff Kevin, did in fact start dating showgirl Robin Ross. And he was not aware that she was not what she was purporting to be. And in a very thankfully famous scene that has been retained, you see Arnold Feather trying to seduce her, and you see the character of Robin, as played by Carlotta, having to explain to him, I'm not a girl. And then you see the shock on Arnold Feather's face. And he responds to that by saying, Miss Ross, Mr. Ross? And, you know, some people look at that scene today and think, well, that's transphobic. You're making fun of her. But in actual fact, that's not what's happening at all. You've got in 1973, for the first time on TV anywhere in the world.
74, wasn't it?
No, 73, Carlotta was in that. Okay, yeah, she was March 1973. Okay. And you've got on free-to-air network TV a trans woman who's having a romance. She's in the show for several weeks. And she doesn't stick around. Arnold Feather doesn't want to pursue the relationship after that. But as Benjamin Law pointed out to me after watching this for the documentary, he goes, she doesn't get dehumanized in any way. People don't point and scream at her when they find out that she's not a girl, as she puts it. And they treat her with respect in that show. And, you know, you just have to look at the fact that the authentic casting in that, to actually have a trans actor playing a trans role, it takes American TV nearly 30 years for them to be as authentic as we were back in the 70s. So that is a truly groundbreaking world first. And what you've got to remember is that Carlotta was known to the Australian public at that stage. She'd been appearing on TV since the 1960s. She was part of a show in Sydney called Lay Girls, which was considered the height of sophisticated entertainment in King's Cross. If you're a tourist and you went to Sydney and you went to King's Cross, you went to see the show where the showgirls were actually female impersonators. And, you know, just about everybody's mother and father from that era saw Lay Girls, which played for years and years in the Cross and was a very, very famous tourist attraction.
Tell me briefly about the TV show The Box, which started on the same network in 1974, and the depiction of lesbians in both The Box and Number 96.
So Number 96 was extremely fortunate because you had created David Sale, who was gay, and he had brought in story editor Johnny White, who was also gay. And together they had a real camp sensibility. They'd worked together before. They were brilliant at writing comedy. And so their depictions of gay and bisexual and trans people as per the world they knew was spot on and was written with real authenticity. There weren't, however, any lesbian writers, or certainly none that identified as open lesbians. And so when number 96 finally got round to a lesbian character, she turned out to be a devil-worshipping witch who was going to sacrifice Abigail's character to the devil because they discovered she was actually a virgin. So that's not a great depiction for the first lesbian character on TV in the world. And then when The Box comes along, The Box was a show that was also bought by the O10 network, and it ran in tandem to number 96. Number 96 ran for 5 nights a week, Monday to Friday at 8:30. When The Box started, it ran Monday to Friday at 9 p.m. in tandem to it. And The Box tried really hard to be even more adult and more shocking than number 96. They decided they would have a regular gay character. He was Lee Whiteman, as played by Paul Caro. And the producers of number 96 weren't terribly impressed by that. They thought that in going for the stereotypical limp-wristed gay man, that they were undoing a lot of the work they'd done by showing that gay men didn't necessarily have to be like that in number 96. But I think in defense of The Box, there were gay TV directors who were quite open about their campness, working the industry at the time. And everybody in The Box, every character, which was a show set at a TV station, was based on real people at the time. So I think that Paul Caro, he did win over the audience. Lee Campman was a very, very camp man. But Paul Caro actually was voted Best Actor by the readers of TV Week in the Logie Awards. So people responded to that character. I don't think they quite got their lesbian characters right. I think they used that in their first episode. There was a
kiss, wasn't it?
There was a kiss. It was the first girl-on-girl kiss on a TV drama anywhere in the world. But I think it's really interesting when you look at the characters. Neither of those characters was a strict lesbian. Both of the characters were bisexual. They kissed each other in the first episode because that caused a stir and created a lot of buzz around its opening night. But if you look at the character of Vicky Stafford, as played by Judy Nunn, she actually only went on to maybe kiss one more girl throughout the history of The Box. In actual fact, the character of Vicky Stafford actually settled down with a man and ended up living a heteronormative life. So for what was presented as a rapacious bisexual reporter who would do anything to get a story, in actual fact, once The Box got underway, Vicky Stafford turned out not to be as excited about the women as we were led to believe.
And then later on, of course, on Australian television on the same network, we've got what we know in Australia as Prisoner, and what is known in the UK as Prisoner Cell Block H. And that had a lot of depiction of lesbians, but in a prison setting. Yeah,
and so again, you wouldn't call them positive role models because they're all criminals. But when Prisoner starts, the breakout character in the show is a lesbian bikie in jail for armed robbery and murder. And that character of Frankie Doyle, as played by Carol Burns, becomes the character that never gets forgotten in Prisoner, even though she's only in it for 16 or 32 episodes, whichever of those two it is. She is very much an iconic character in that show. And I think what's interesting about her characters is once you actually get to understand the character of Frankie Doyle and you find out why she's got this violent past and what she's trying to overcome, the audience falls in love with her, and indeed they cry when she exits the series.
What are your earliest memories of number 96 on TV in the 70s, and how did it affect you and Australian TV viewing audiences? Did it help young LGBT kids at the time, do you think?
I truly do think it did. I was 10 years old when it started, and I distinctly remember the first time I saw a promo for it on TV, and I had this overwhelming attraction to it, even from the first promo. And I remember turning to my parents and saying, I want to watch that. And I recall the look of horror crossing their faces that I was showing any interest in it at all. And the thing about it was that this is back in an era when we only had 4 TV channels, and Number 96 quickly became the most watched show on Australian TV. And I was buying TV Week at the time, and the show was being written about in the TV magazine. So under the guise of I'm buying this magazine because the Brady Bunch are on the cover, I'm also learning about Number 96. And yes, I was going to a Catholic school, and most of the kids there, their parents didn't want them to watch the show. But there was a handful of kids that was watching it, and we grilled them for information. And that was happening at schoolyards all across Australia for several years there. What happened on Number 96 was the number one topic in the schoolyard. Everyone was talking about the fact, there was a bit of nudity last night. And also, everybody was talking about the fact that Don was a poofter. That word was being thrown about as a slur, but it was also being thrown around. I mean, I knew I was gay at that stage. I don't know that I had a language for it, but I knew that I was attracted to men. I knew that I wanted to look at naked men. And so I was attracted to Number 96 because I knew that there were gay characters in there, and I was looking at the pin-ups of Joe Hesham and everyone in TV Week. So I was very, very aware of it. But it's only now, as an old man, that I'm really coming to grips with the effect that it had on me. Because certainly I became obsessed with Number 96, and probably still am a little bit today. And I just wore my parents down. I never stopped asking to watch that show. And eventually we got a black and white TV in the kitchen, and they said, go into that room and watch it and shut up about it. And so eventually I got to see a lot of it. But it's in the making of this documentary and talking to other gay people who are younger than me, and I'm talking about people that are only 10 years younger than me. So if I'm growing up in the 70s seeing all of this on TV, if you talk to someone who's 10 years younger than me who grew up in the 80s, they see nothing. If you go through the 80s and the 90s at that development stage, the only gay men you see on TV are sick and dying of AIDS. That's the difference. I grow up seeing gay characters on Number 96, The Box and Prisoner, and being very aware of it, and knowing that these guys are successful in their jobs, that they're liked by their communities, that people think they're fun and they want to be around them, to then not noticing the fact that that depiction wasn't there in the 80s and the 90s as AIDS took hold. And so that is quite incredible. And I realise now that what is missing from my youth, which I hear from a lot of gay people today, even people who are growing up today in 2023, is the shame of being gay. I suffered not a moment of guilt or shame around it. I'm not saying that my life was perfect, that I didn't get bullied, that I didn't get called poofter. I did. But it bounced off me. In my head, all I was thinking was, I won't be at this school forever, and when I go out into the real world, I'm going to be whoever I want to be. And I really now credit that with the positive depictions of gay men that I was seeing on TV, because I'm now very aware that there are a whole bunch of kids who didn't see that and inched into that lifestyle with a whole bunch of guilt and shame and internalized homophobia, which I feel very fortunate not to have endured.
Some kids were secretly watching the show for its heterosexual sexual content, even though it was programmed at 8:30 p.m. at night, and that caused a bit of a stir in the press at the time.
Yeah, there was massive alarm is the word that was being used at the fact that when they were doing surveys amongst kids to find out what was their favourite TV show, Number 96 was coming in at number 2 behind the Brady Bunch. Number 1, the Brady Bunch. Number 2, Number 96. Number 3, Bugs Bunny. Pick the odd man out there. Number 96 was a show not aimed at children. The actors in Number 96 were alarmed to be getting fan mail from 6-year-old kids who could barely write. But you see, the thing about Number 96 is that this was the first time we'd ever really seen a show with Australians in it on TV. All we'd ever seen on Australian TV before that were cop shows like Homicide and Matlock Police. And suddenly you've got a show on TV that is very attractive to young kids because half of the action in Number 96 was comedy. There were all these hilarious comic characters in it, like Arnold Feather and Dory Evans and Aldo, and all of this camp comedy that was very attractive to kids. And yes, so there were kids watching it for comedy. There were kids watching it who were straight, who were dying to see a flash of Abigail as she was getting in and out of bed, and what was then quite subtle nudity. But what was happening was that they were also, through osmosis, learning about gay people. And they were seeing that, and I have found it very, very interesting watching all of Number 96 for the first time in 50 years and seeing episodes I saw as a little boy and having this shock of, oh my God, I remember that scene. I don't remember the episode. I can't remember a lot of the storylines, but there are moments in it that I remember. And I think what's really interesting about watching it all is realizing that there was this depiction that even though a gay slur might be thrown at them, even though you kind of go, oh, someone just called Don a pufter behind his back. But then you realise, oh, because that's what would have been happening back in the 70s. Yes, there would have been people who would have been nice to your face, but behind your back, they would refer to you as a limp-wristed pufter. And that was shocking to me. It's like, oh, why are they saying that? But then I thought to myself, no, that's actually incredibly realistic. And I think that's what Number 96 captured. It captured a moment in Australian society where people were getting their heads around this and actually going, oh, actually, that guy over there is okay. He's black or he's gay, but I'm actually having a beer with him in the pub and that's okay. But that still didn't mean that when he went home and spoke to his wife about that, he didn't use a slur when he described that person. I think that's a very realistic way of looking at it. And it's interesting to me to see that Number 96 wasn't a gay utopia. That yes, there were gay and bisexual and lesbian characters in there, but some of the characters, and particular characters who came from the country to the city, it was very obvious with them that they were like, oh, there's pufters, they're pufters. They were uncomfortable about it. And you know what? That would be happening today. You know, you've still got people in the country that get uncomfortable about these big city notions. So I actually thought that made it even more realistic.
Australia is typically thought of as having a fairly blokey or macho culture. Do you think all these shows, especially Number 96, helped lay the groundwork for the average Australian to become more accepting of LGBT people, especially when HIV came along in the 80s, or the growth of the Sydney gay and lesbian Mardi Gras during the same period?
I think the way to look at this is to look at the influences that we had in Australia at the time. I've often described Australian TV as a bit of a combination and blending of American TV and British TV. And I think amongst that, you know, I think there's always been a very healthy appreciation here in Australia for camp humour. So Mr. Humphries in Are You Being Served, hugely popular all around the world. But I think that Australians in particular, I think we actually have a very keen sense of camp in this country. Because yes, while we're very blokey and while we're very macho and while the early days of Australia, there were far more men in some of these situations going back to convicts than there were women. If you look really closely at that, there is also a real appreciation of campness in this country. And I think that's why you can have Carlotta becoming a household name through the 60s. We knew a trans woman here in Australia. I think that's why you can also look at Dame Edna Everage, as played by Barry Humphries. We love the fact that he's another man in a frock. If you look at the Auntie Jack show, which has absolutely nothing gay about that Auntie Jack character at all, but Yeah, we've always kind of appreciated gay humour, and I think that's come to us from our British forebears. And so I think that did make us more open to new concepts. And as former High Court Justice 𝐀𝐭⁰𝐫𝐞𝐫𝐞 says in Outrageous, he believes that the societal memory of seeing gay lives being normalised as just like everybody else on number 96 for 5 years, every night of the week, he thinks that did something to Australian society, that did help Australia deal with the AIDS crisis faster and better than any other Western country in the world. I mean, while Ronald Reagan in America refused to say the word AIDS, and while Margaret Thatcher was sitting there in the UK doing nothing about AIDS, here in Australia we got onto it and did something about it. And as a result of that, hundreds of thousands of lives were saved, and other countries began copying the strategies that we invented here in Australia.
Being such a world first in many ways, why hasn't number 96 had more recognition worldwide in the LGBT community?
Well, I think people just don't know about it. I think the fact that it couldn't be screened on TV, I think even the fact that it still couldn't be screened on TV in the 80s and the 90s, you still couldn't put number 96 on free-to-air TV now on American TV. It's still the nudity in it. There's still no nudity on American TV. So you couldn't screen number 96 50 years later. So,
What about in Europe?
Well, maybe in Europe and maybe in the UK, post-Watershed, 9 p.m. And, I think that number 96 would have taken off in the UK, because if they fell in love with Prisoner late at night, they would have fallen in love with it, because I've looked at some of those early episodes of number 96 and I see a lot of similarities in the comedy between the classic Coronation Street comedy. The shows were very, very alike, and there's no doubt in my mind that the Brits would have loved it had they been allowed to see it. They did try to sell it to the Brits, but of course the tabloids, they tried at Cannes to get some international broadcasters in it, but the British tabloid press just went, we're not going to screen this filthy show from Australia, and kind of clamped down on it and said that they didn't want it. And I think it's a real shame that they've never seen it. I'd like to think that one day people who are interested in this might have an opportunity to see it if one day all of number 96 could be streamed. Having said that, half of it has been destroyed because the show was being made in black and white for half of its transmission. When Australia went to colour TV, it was thought as just being a soap opera, that there would be no repeats. Nobody knew about home video back then. Nobody could see the future of streaming. So they threw away those early 600 groundbreaking episodes of number 96. We still have the colour episodes. My hope is that one day the rest of the world and Australians can get to see all of them. But people around the world don't know about it because it was simply too groundbreaking and racy for them to ever see.
Anything else you'd like to add?
I would just like to point this one thing out, and I'd like to explain this for, say, let's compare it, as I do in the doco, to All in the Family. And it's a good comparison to make, because during the 3 years that number 96 was the number one rating show on Australian TV, which is 1972, 73, 74, at the same time, All in the Family is the highest rated show on American TV. And All in the Family is recognised for being groundbreaking, and they were tackling taboo subjects just like number 96 and doing stuff like racism and rape and breast cancer and all these things that were taboo subjects once upon a time on TV. But imagine this. All in the Family made 205 episodes and 5 of them had queer characters in it. All in the Family screened once a week on TV. Now imagine if All in the Family had screened 5 nights a week on TV like number 96, and imagine if Archie Bunker lived next door to a heroic gay lawyer like Don. Imagine the impact that would have had on American TV, as opposed to them dipping out of queer themes, which is great, they were doing it, but You weren't seeing him on TV every night of the week. And that's where number 96 and the box is revolutionary, because they didn't just go, here's a gay character, our straight characters are going to have to deal with them and decide whether or not they're going to accept them. But we actually saw straight characters welcoming queer characters into their lives every night of the week for 5 years. And that just wasn't done anywhere else in the world in the 70s. And that's why number 96 changed Australian society in a way that All in the Family did, but could have done so much more if there'd been the appetite for it.
Australian TV historian Andrew Mercado, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Thanks, Barry.